In 7 to 9 months of deep space transit, the human body absorbs more radiation than NASA allows in an entire career. That is not an estimate. That is a measured number from instruments aboard the Curiosity rover during its cruise to Mars in 2011 and 2012. One way. Before landing. Before the surface, where radiation levels run 250 times higher than anything you're absorbing right now. The crossing alone pushes past the career limit NASA set to protect its astronauts over a lifetime of spaceflight, and then the crew still has to land, still has to work, still has to survive the return. Radiation is one of 4 problems. Each of the 4 is serious enough to halt a mission on its own. Together, they describe a wall built from physics and biology, not from budget lines or political will. Tonight we're going to go through all 4 carefully. No shortcuts, no reassuring summaries. By the end of this, you will know exactly why no human being has ever walked on Mars after 60 years of trying, and why the answer has almost nothing to do with the rocket. If this kind of patient, precise investigation is what you are here for, a subscribe helps this channel find more people who want exactly this. A like tells the algorithm to show this to curious people who need it tonight. Now let's begin. Mars does not move on your schedule, and no amount of engineering changes that. Most people who think about getting humans to Mars think about the rocket first. That is the visible thing. When a heavy lift vehicle climbs off the pad, and the boosters separate cleanly, and the payload fairing peels away in the sunlit upper atmosphere, it looks like progress. Like the barrier between humans and Mars is mostly thrust and engineering. Build a powerful enough vehicle, point it at the right dot in the sky, and the rest is patience. That picture is missing something that has nothing to do with thrust or engineering or money. Earth and Mars both orbit the Sun, but they orbit at different speeds along paths of different sizes. Earth completes one orbit in 365 days. Mars requires 687 days for the same circuit. Because they move at different rates, their positions relative to each other change continuously. Sometimes the 2 planets sit on the same side of the Sun. Sometimes they sit on opposite sides, separated by the full width of their combined orbits. The distance between Earth and Mars is not a fixed number. It swings between roughly 55 million kilometers at closest approach to more than 400 million kilometers at maximum separation. That is a 7-fold change driven by nothing but orbital geometry. A fuel-efficient trip to Mars is only possible when the geometry aligns. The spacecraft must follow a curved arc, an ellipse, that departs from Earth's orbital position and intercepts Mars's orbital position at the exact moment Mars arrives there. Miss the geometry and the fuel math becomes catastrophic. The propellant required to force the crossing outside the optimal window is not merely expensive, it is more than any launch vehicle in existence can carry. Those windows open once every 26 months. Not seasonally, not annually, every 26 months. When one closes, the next is 780 days away. Every Mars mission ever launched has clustered inside these windows. Every crewed Mars plan in the 60-year history of human spaceflight has been organised around the same orbital calendar. The first serious crewed Mars proposal was published by Wernher von Braun in 1952. The most recent detailed architecture was updated in 2024. Every plan between them has been built around the same constraint, not because the planners lacked creativity, because the calendar cannot be changed. Sit with that for a moment. The calendar that governs when humans can go to Mars was set 4.5 billion years ago when the solar system formed. When a crew departs inside one of these windows, they do not fly in a straight line. They follow a Hohmann transfer orbit, an ellipse that arcs outward from Earth and bends through space for 7 to 9 months before intersecting Mars. The spacecraft is not aimed at where Mars is at launch. It is aimed at where Mars will be when it arrives, 8 months from now, at a point that does not yet exist in space, waiting to be occupied. The elegance of this is real. The precision is real. Orbital mechanics is deterministic. which means if you know exactly where Earth and Mars are today, you can compute exactly where they will be next September to within meters. That kind of exactness is genuinely beautiful. What is not clean is what happens 20 minutes after the last burn. From that moment, the spacecraft is on a fixed arc. There is no mid-course abort, no pulling off the highway and driving home. To change the trajectory significantly now would require fuel that was not loaded. The crew is committed. They're going to Mars, they will arrive at Mars, and they will wait there until the orbital geometry allows a return, which will not happen for approximately 500 days after landing. The total mission from departure to Earth landing spans roughly 2.5 to 3 years. This is the constraint inside which everything else in Mars mission planning must fit. Not the rocket, not the habitat, the window. The window determines when launch must occur. The launch date determines the radiation exposure profile of the transit. The transit duration determines the minimum surface stay before a return window opens. The surface stay duration determines how much food and water and oxygen and medical supplies must be delivered in the initial payload. Every decision about how to design a crewed Mars mission begins with 26 months and works backward. Now consider the solution that seems to dissolve this problem: nuclear thermal propulsion. If you can reduce the transit time from 7 to 9 months down to 45 days, the window constraint weakens substantially. A faster ship could depart somewhat outside the optimal window and burn additional propellant to compensate. A short transit also cuts radiation exposure dramatically. Both the scheduling problem and the radiation problem appear to dissolve at once. This is an old idea. NASA's NERVA program tested nuclear thermal engines in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A nuclear thermal rocket heats propellant by passing it through a reactor core rather than by combustion, achieving exhaust velocities roughly twice that of a chemical engine. Analyses consistently suggest a nuclear thermal vehicle could reach Mars in 3 to 4 months. The problem it appears to solve is real. The collapse comes from the rocket equation. The rocket equation does not care what type of engine you use. It cares about the ratio of propellant mass to payload mass. A nuclear thermal rocket travelling faster burns through its efficiency advantage on the higher velocity required and must carry that propellant mass regardless. The fuel has to come from somewhere. Every kilogram must be launched from Earth or pre-positioned in orbit, which requires its own launches and its own windows. The window problem does not disappear. It redistributes into a logistics architecture problem about pre-positioning propellant in orbit, which is itself constrained by the same 26-month cadence. And NERVA was cancelled in 1972. No nuclear thermal rocket has ever been certified for crewed flight. No design is close to operational status today. The ship that would dissolve the window and radiation problem simultaneously remains a technology that might exist in the 2030s or 2040s, not something that exists now. There is no pulling over, there is no cavalry. The window opens when the planets are ready, and the planets do not wait. Here is where the window becomes more than a scheduling constraint. Here is where it becomes a survival architecture. A colony on Mars is not only dependent on the 26-month window for its initial delivery, it is dependent on that window continuously, forever. Every resupply shipment, every replacement component for critical life support hardware, every medical resource the colony cannot produce locally. All of it arrives through windows that open once every 26 months and close again. If critical hardware fails between windows, the colony must repair it with what it has on hand, or it waits 780 days for the possibility of help. There is no emergency resupply. There is no calling for help and receiving it in time. The window problem has a corollary that is even more constraining than the launch timing itself. Abort options. After departure, they do not exist in any meaningful form. On every crewed spaceflight before a Mars mission, some form of abort existed. Not comfortable options, but options. When an oxygen tank exploded aboard Apollo 13 on the way to the Moon, The crew used the lunar module as a lifeboat while the spacecraft swung around the moon and returned home. They survived because Earth was 3 days away. A Mars mission has no equivalent. The spacecraft is following a Hohmann transfer arc that commits it to the 7 to 9 month crossing, the moment the final burn completes. To abort meaningfully after that point requires fuel the spacecraft does not carry. A medical emergency that would trigger early mission termination on an ISS mission or a lunar mission must instead be managed in place for the remainder of the transit. A critical system failure must be repaired or worked around in deep space, with no support in real time and no emergency resupply possible. The spacecraft that a Mars crew inhabits during transit must support life not only under nominal conditions, it must support life through any medical emergency, any system failure, any psychological crisis that emerges during 9 months. Because the alternative to solving the problem aboard is not rescue, it is death. Every contingency requires resources carried from the beginning, spare parts for every system that could fail lethally, medical supplies for every condition that could present during 9 months with 6 crew members, redundancy in redundancy. Because the first backup failing is not survivable when the spacecraft is months from any help. Every kilogram of contingency mass costs fuel to accelerate. Every kilogram of fuel is another kilogram the window-constrained launch architecture must accommodate. The mass problem is not a question of willingness to build a larger rocket. It is a question of what physics allows within the constraints of orbital mechanics and chemical propulsion at the scale any realistic launch architecture can achieve. That is the first wall, not a rocket problem, a planetary geometry problem, a supply chain problem, an abort option problem, all wearing the same orbital mechanics costume. Mars sits on its own calendar set 4.5 billion years ago, and that calendar is the irreducible constraint inside which everything else about Mars must be accommodated. The second wall is inside the human body, and it has been accumulating since the engines cut out. The agricultural calendar on a Mars surface colony is constrained by the supply window in a way that most discussions of Mars farming overlook entirely. Seeds, soil amendments, agricultural chemicals, specialized nutrients, irrigation hardware, and grow light replacements all arrive through the 26-month window. Agricultural planning must therefore anticipate 2 full growing cycles in advance, ordering what will be needed before the current growing season has begun, based on projected yield from seeds that may perform differently in Martian regolith than they did in Earth-based analog tests. If a seed variety performs poorly, if a pest or pathogen enters the system unexpectedly, if a nutrient depletion pattern in the regolith differs from what was modelled, the correction is not a delivery away. It is 780 days away if it was not already ordered in the current window, and likely a full 26-month cycle away if the situation was not anticipated. Agricultural research is iterative. You learn from one season's results and adjust the next season's approach. On Earth, the iteration cycle is 1 year or less. On Mars, the iteration cycle for inputs that come from Earth is 26 months at minimum. A decade of agricultural development on Mars is roughly 5 iterations of any experiment that requires Earth resupply to run. Compared to the development pace of terrestrial agriculture, which iterates annually and draws on centuries of accumulated knowledge, Martian agriculture starts from near zero and iterates slowly. There is also the question of what the transit does to the spacecraft itself over 9 months. Electronics exposed to sustained cosmic ray bombardment accumulate single-event upsets, bit flip errors in memory caused by ionizing particles passing through semiconductor material. Modern electronics are designed with error-correcting codes and hardened components to manage this in the near-Earth environment. In the deeper radiation environment of a Mars transit, the rate of single-event upsets increases. The most sensitive and critical avionics, the systems that control propulsion, life support and navigation, must be designed with substantial redundancy against radiation-induced errors. This adds complexity and abeyance to systems that are already mass-critical. The radiation problem is not only a biological problem, it is a spacecraft reliability problem as well. Every day of the crossing adds accumulated radiation damage to the electronics that keep the crew alive. The 26-month cadence also constrains something that receives almost no attention in public discussions of Mars colonization: mental health infrastructure. A Mars colony will have mental health crises. That is not a prediction based on pessimism. It is a statistical certainty for any normal population under sustained stress in a confined, isolated environment. The analogue research from Antarctic stations, nuclear submarines, and long-duration ISS missions consistently shows that psychological episodes, ranging from adjustment difficulties to acute psychiatric crises, occur at rates proportional to mission duration and isolation severity. A Mars colony is more isolated and more confined than any analogue ever studied. The mental health resources the colony can access are whatever its medical personnel were trained in, and whatever pharmacological supplies were loaded through the last supply window. The next pharmacy delivery is 780 days away. The next specialist consultation is a 22-minute one-way delay from the nearest psychiatrist. The window governs not just when the colony can receive supplies, it governs the colony's intellectual and technical development as well. New technologies, new procedures, new designs, new medical protocols developed on Earth cannot reach the colony except through the window. If a critical vulnerability in the colony's water recycling design is identified on Earth after departure, the fix cannot be transmitted instantaneously. It must wait for a cargo window to deliver the hardware required to implement it. The colony operates, from the moment of departure, on a technological snapshot of Earth's capabilities at the time the last cargo window closed. It cannot upgrade faster than the window allows. That is the depth of the first wall, not a single constraint but a system of constraints, each connected to the others, all governed by the same 26-month orbital clock. The window is the spine of the whole enterprise. Every other problem the colony faces is harder because of it. The difference between a Mars mission and every previous human spaceflight is not one of degree. It is one of kind. Every previous crewed spaceflight has operated under what could be called the lifeline principle. No matter how far the mission went, no matter what went wrong, there was always a thread connecting the crew to Earth that was short enough to matter operationally. The ISS is 250 miles up. A crew in distress can return home in hours. The Apollo missions were 240,000 miles out, 3 days home. Communication delay of 1.3 seconds each way. When Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded on the way to the Moon, the crew and mission control collaborated in something close to real time. Engineers on the ground improvised emergency solutions. Procedures were transmitted back up within minutes. That collaboration, that real-time problem-solving across a 240,000-mile gap, is what saved the crew. Mars is not 240,000 miles. Mars is between 34 million and 250 million miles, depending on where the planets happen to be in their orbits. At closest approach, light takes 3 minutes to travel between the two worlds. At maximum separation, 22 minutes. A crew member on Mars sends a distress signal. Up to 22 minutes later, the signal arrives at Earth. Mission control reacts immediately. Their response takes another 22 minutes to arrive back at Mars. The minimum round-trip time for a single exchange is 6 minutes. The maximum is 44 minutes. The Apollo 13 improvisation that saved the crew, the kind of real-time collaborative problem-solving that relied on constant back and forth between the crew and Earth, is structurally impossible at Mars distances. Every decision a Mars crew must make under pressure must be made by the crew alone, with whatever information they have, with no real-time guidance from Earth. This is not a communication technology problem. Radio signals travel at the speed of light. The speed of light is the speed of light. There is no engineering around it. Furthermore, every 26 months the Sun passes directly between Earth and Mars as seen from Earth, a period called solar conjunction. During conjunction, radio signals travelling between the two worlds must pass through or near the solar corona, the superheated plasma of the Sun's outer atmosphere. The interference is severe enough that reliable communication becomes impossible. NASA does not attempt to send commands to Mars orbiters and rovers during conjunction periods. The blackout lasts for several weeks. A Mars colony experiences that blackout too. For several weeks every 26 months, the colony is completely cut off from Earth. No communication in either direction, no telemetry, no status updates, no emergency contact. The colony manages whatever arises, alone, for the duration of the blackout. These are not solvable problems. They are geometric and physical properties of the solar system. They are the same properties that have been true since the planets formed, and they will be true for as long as the sun burns. The deeper implication of the window is what it means for the pace of learning. Every major challenge in the history of human technology has been solved faster as the iteration cycle accelerated. Aircraft development from the Wright brothers to the jet age took 40 years, partly because each iteration cycle, designing, building, testing, crashing, learning, redesigning, took months or years. Computing advanced at extraordinary speed, partly because the iteration cycle compressed to days and then hours and then minutes. The faster you can test an idea, the faster you learn which ideas work. Mars mission planning operates on a 26-month iteration cycle for anything that requires physical hardware to reach the surface. An idea tested in the current supply window and found to be wrong produces a correction that arrives in the next window. That correction is tested, and if it needs further refinement, the next correction arrives in the window after that. 3 iterations of a critical design question take 6 years. 10 iterations takes 20 years. The slow pace of hardware iteration on Mars is not a problem of will or funding. It is a consequence of orbital mechanics. The window governs not just supply but learning. This is why the work done on Earth before the first crewed missions matters so profoundly. Every design question answered here, with full access to research facilities and manufacturing and rapid iteration cycles, is a design question that does not need to be answered on Mars at 26-month intervals. The preparation phase of Mars colonization, the decades of research and development and testing that precede the first permanent settlement, is not a delay. It is the compression of what would otherwise be centuries of painful 26-month iteration into a shorter period of rapid terrestrial learning. The window does not yield, but it rewards preparation. The window does not yield, but it rewards preparation. And preparation, done honestly, requires looking at all 4 walls without flinching. Your bone marrow does not know the difference between a mission and a death sentence. Radiation is often treated in public discussions of Mars as one item on a long checklist. Something real, yes, but manageable with good engineering. We have shielding. We have dosimetry systems. We have 50 years of experience protecting astronauts in low Earth orbit. The history of human spaceflight is the history of identifying real dangers and designing around them. Micrometeorite shielding, re-entry heat management, carbon dioxide scrubbing, cabin pressure regulation. Each was a genuine threat. Each became a managed risk. Radiation is supposed to follow the same arc. The difference with galactic cosmic radiation is that the solutions which worked for those earlier challenges do not work here. A galactic cosmic ray is an atomic nucleus, typically a proton or a heavier nucleus such as iron, that has been stripped of its electrons and accelerated to nearly the speed of light by the aftermath of a supernova or a pulsar or a neutron star collision somewhere in the galaxy. The particle has been travelling through interstellar space for potentially millions of years. It carries energy millions of times higher than anything produced by the most powerful particle accelerator ever built on Earth. When it enters a spacecraft hull, it does not stop at the wall. It passes through aluminum as though the wall were not there. It passes through water. It passes through human tissue, along its track through biological material, It ionizes atoms, breaks chemical bonds, and shatters DNA strands in ways that low-energy ionizing radiation does not. A single high-energy ion nucleus traversing a cell nucleus can cause damage equivalent to thousands of simultaneous low-energy hits. The cell's DNA repair machinery struggles to address that level of simultaneous injury. Misrepair is common. Persistent genomic instability can propagate through subsequent cell divisions for years. On Earth, none of this reaches you in meaningful quantities. Earth's magnetic field deflects the majority of incoming cosmic rays before they reach the upper atmosphere. The atmosphere absorbs most of the remainder. At sea level, you absorb a manageable background. The dose is low enough that the body's repair mechanisms handle it without visible consequence over a normal lifetime. Step outside Earth's magnetic field, everything changes. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers altitude, still inside the outer edge of Earth's magnetic protection. Astronauts aboard the ISS receive radiation doses roughly 150 to 200 times higher than people at sea level. A 6-month stay increases lifetime cancer risk by roughly 1% above baseline. NASA considers this acceptable for trained volunteers. It is managed. It is not zero. Take a breath here. What comes next is where the numbers stop being manageable. Beyond Earth's magnetic field, in the interplanetary space a Mars-bound crew would traverse for 7 to 9 months. The radiation environment is categorically worse. The Curiosity rover carried a radiation assessment detector during its 253-day cruise to Mars in 2011 and 2012. The instrument was not measuring Mars. It was measuring the transit inside the spacecraft to document what a human crew would absorb on the same crossing. The measurement it returned was a one-way transit dose of approximately 300 millisieverts under average solar conditions. NASA's current career exposure limit for astronauts is 600 millisieverts lifetime. That limit exists to keep the probability of exposure-induced cancer death below 3% over a full career. The one-way transit to Mars, under average conditions, consumes half that lifetime budget before the crew has arrived. The surface will add more. Mars lost its global magnetic field approximately 4 billion years ago. Without a magnetic field, nothing deflects the solar wind or the continuous rain of galactic cosmic rays. Mars's thin atmosphere, less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure, provides almost no additional shielding. Surface radiation on Mars runs approximately 250 times higher than at Earth's surface. A full year on the Martian surface adds another 200 to 300 millisieverts. The return trip home adds another 300. Add those numbers. 300 millisieverts outbound, 200 to 300 on the surface, 300 back. A round-trip mission delivers approximately 800 to 900 millisieverts cumulative dose, against a career limit of 600. The mission would require NASA to formally grant each crew member a documented waiver permitting exposure above the standard designed to protect astronaut health over a lifetime. This is not a number derived from models. The transit component is direct measurement from hardware that has already made the crossing. The Curiosity rover's RIC instrument recorded the data. It exists. The surface component is measured by that same instrument across years of Martian surface operations. These numbers are not speculative. Now the solution that consistently appears and consistently fails. Shielding. The physics of why hydrogen-rich materials are better shielding than aluminum is real. Water and polyethylene attenuate incoming particles more efficiently per kilogram than metal. This is correct. But galactic cosmic ray particles carry so much energy that they penetrate deeply through any practical thickness of material. An ion nucleus at 90% of the speed of light does not slow in a few centimeters of water. It punches through. Worse, when it does interact with shielding material, it undergoes nuclear fragmentation. The incoming nucleus shatters on impact, producing a spray of lighter secondary particles, neutrons, protons, alpha particles, and nuclear fragments that scatter outward in all directions, including toward the crew compartment behind the shield. In some shielding geometries, the total biological dose delivered to crew members is actually higher with shielding than without it, because the secondary shower irradiates a larger tissue volume than the original particle would have. To reduce galactic cosmic ray dose by a factor of 2 using water shielding requires surrounding the crew module with roughly 2 meters of water in all directions. 2 meters of water around a habitat large enough for 6 people for 9 months of transit. The mass of that shielding runs into hundreds of metric tons. Getting hundreds of metric tons from low Earth orbit to a Mars-bound trajectory requires propellant, which requires launches, which requires the same windows. The shielding that halves the transit dose makes the mission substantially more complex and expensive, while cutting the risk to approximately 450 millisieverts, which still exceeds the career limit. The shielding is a partial mitigation. It is not a solution. First false hope collapsed. Now the second, solar energetic particle events. These are episodic, intense bursts of charged particles ejected by solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Unlike the chronic background of galactic cosmic rays, a major solar particle event can deliver a dangerous dose in hours. The standard countermeasure is a storm shelter, a section of the spacecraft with enhanced shielding where crew retreat during an event. The 1972 solar energetic particle event, which occurred between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, was large enough that it would have been potentially fatal to crew members in an inadequate shelter. A storm shelter works against this specific threat. It adds mass. It addresses one component of the radiation environment. It leaves the chronic galactic cosmic ray background, the larger long-term threat, largely unaddressed. Second false hope collapsed. The neurological dimension of this problem receives far less attention than cancer risk, but may be equally consequential for whether the mission succeeds at all. Galactic cosmic rays do not only damage rapidly dividing cells like bone marrow precursors and gut lining, they damage neurons. The human central nervous system contains neurons that are not meaningfully replaced when they die. Unlike liver cells or skin cells, mature neurons in the brain and spinal cord do not regenerate in significant numbers after damage. Research conducted through NASA's Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Laboratory has exposed rodents to simulated galactic cosmic radiation at doses calibrated to what a Mars mission crew would receive, then measured the neurological consequences over months afterward. The results show persistent deficits in learning and memory, increased anxiety responses, reduced ability to distinguish novel from familiar stimuli, measurable reduction in the density and structural complexity of dendritic spines. The tiny projections that form synaptic connections between neurons. The damage did not heal over the months the studies tracked. Translating rodent findings to human physiology requires scientific caution. The parallel is not one-to-one, but the direction of the effect, that sustained exposure to galactic cosmic radiation at Mars mission, doses produces measurable, persistent neurological changes, is a finding that no amount of methodological caution allows mission planners to set aside. The crew members most needed to diagnose unexpected system failures and improvise repairs, to manage interpersonal tension during months of confinement, to make complex decisions under high stress, would be the same crew members who arrived at Mars having accumulated dose to the organs that make those capabilities possible. There is also the psychological dimension of knowing. An astronaut who understands before departure that the crossing will deliver a dose exceeding career limits has made a conscious decision about their own long-term health. The middle months of a 9-month transit, months 3 through 6, represent the period most distant from both departure and arrival. The star field outside the window does not change perceptibly from one week to the next. There are no landmarks. There is only the unchanged void and the confined interior and the 6 people who share it, all of them accumulating dose they cannot stop, all of them aware that the tally is running. The mission does not fail because something dramatic happens. It fails because nothing dramatic happens for so long that the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small degradations exceeds the crew's capacity to cope. Now close the loop. Transit time cannot be reduced to clinically acceptable levels without propulsion technology that does not yet fly on crewed missions. The 26-month window governs the minimum transit duration. The transit duration governs the minimum dose. The minimum dose already exceeds the career limit. These are not three separate technical problems. They are one compounding problem viewed from three different angles, and each angle makes the problem look worse, not better. The biology does not wait for the engineering. The radiation will not stop the mission by itself. But the third wall is waiting at the destination, and it operates on the same bodies already carrying the dose from the crossing. The question of what the radiation exposure does to the crew's ability to make good decisions over time is not separable from the question of mission success. A Mars crew is not just a collection of bodies that need to arrive safely. It is the decision-making apparatus of the colony during the most critical phase of its existence. The first year of a Mars colony, when everything is being established for the first time and the margin for error is smallest, requires the crew to be at their highest cognitive capacity. The Brookhaven animal studies suggest that sustained galactic cosmic ray exposure at Mars mission dose levels produces measurable cognitive deficits that persist after exposure ends. The crew making the higher stakes decisions in the history of human spaceflight will be making them with nervous systems that have been irradiated for 9 months on the way there, and that continue to accumulate dose every day on the surface. This is not an argument against going. It is an argument for understanding clearly what going actually means. There is also the long-term health trajectory of the founding colonists in the years after their mission. The cancer risk from a Mars mission is probabilistic. Not every crew member who receives 800 millisieverts will develop cancer. But statistical probability guarantees that among a sufficiently large group of Mars mission veterans, the elevated cancer rate will be measurable. Some of those individuals will develop cancers in the years and decades after their missions. If the founding colonists are also long-term Mars residents, the colony's long-term medical burden includes a population with systematically elevated cancer rates in a location with no oncology specialists and no comprehensive cancer treatment infrastructure. The first Martian medical facility will not be a cancer centre. It will be whatever medical capability the colony can build with the resources it brought and the skills its members possess. The founding colonists will age into that system carrying a radiation legacy that Earth-based medicine would treat with multidisciplinary oncology teams, imaging equipment, and pharmaceutical supply chains the colony cannot replicate. Here is the factor that makes all of this worse than the individual numbers suggest. Shielding does not solve the problem. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive and most critical fact about galactic cosmic radiation. Adding material around the crew does not reliably reduce their dose. This is not a matter of not having enough shielding yet. It is a consequence of the physics of how high-energy heavy nuclei interact with matter. When a high-energy iron nucleus travelling at 90% of the speed of light strikes an aluminum hull, it does not stop. It passes through. But when it strikes a nucleus of aluminum, the collision can shatter the aluminum nucleus, producing secondary particles that scatter in all directions. Those secondary particles, which include protons, neutrons, and lighter nuclear fragments, each carry significant energy, and each can damage biological tissue. In some configurations, a crew member sitting behind a thick aluminum wall receives more total biological dose from secondary radiation than they would receive from the original cosmic ray passing through a thin wall, or no wall at all. This is not theoretical. It is a documented experimental finding that has shaped how spacecraft radiation shielding is designed. Adding hydrogen-rich material, water or polyethylene, improves the situation somewhat because hydrogen-rich materials are less likely to produce dangerous secondary particles when struck by cosmic rays, but the improvement is partial. 2 meters of water reduces the galactic cosmic ray dose by roughly half. The other half still gets through, and 2 meters of water in all directions around a crude habitat is hundreds of metric tons of mass. Mass that must be launched from Earth. Mass that must be accelerated outward toward Mars. Mass that increases the fuel requirements for the entire mission, which increases the launch requirements, which circles back to the window. False hope ladder. Nuclear thermal propulsion seems to solve transit time, and therefore dose. The engine has not been certified for human spaceflight. Solar storm shelters seem to solve solar particle events. They do not address the chronic galactic cosmic ray background. Magnetic shielding, an artificial magnetic field around the spacecraft, is theoretically sound but requires superconducting magnets operating continuously for 9 months in the deep space environment. No such system has been demonstrated in space. Each apparent solution requires technology that does not currently exist at operational scale. Each collapse reveals the next. The biology does not wait for the engineering. The duration dimension of the radiation problem deserves specific attention because it transforms what might seem like a manageable increase in cancer risk into something qualitatively different. On Earth, workers in radiation-exposed occupations, radiologists, nuclear plant workers, flight crews, accumulate dose slowly over careers measured in decades. The exposures are monitored continuously. If a worker's cumulative dose approaches a threshold, they are reassigned to lower exposure work. The total career exposure is carefully managed. The human body's DNA repair systems can handle low-level chronic exposure reasonably well when the dose accumulates slowly over years with time for repair between insults. A Mars transit delivers approximately 300 millisieverts in 253 days. That is roughly 1.2 millisieverts per day, sustained without interruption for 9 months. The body's repair mechanisms do not get rest periods. The dose accumulates continuously. The ion nuclei and high-energy protons pass through cell nuclei every few days, on average throughout the transit. The damage is not catastrophic in the acute sense. No one becomes acutely ill from radiation during the crossing. But the cumulative effect of 9 months of sustained, above-normal dose rate is not the same as the same total dose delivered more slowly over years with recovery time between exposures. The biological response to dose rate and total dose are related but not identical. A body that has absorbed 300 millisieverts in 9 months may be in a different biological state than a body that has absorbed the same 300 millisieverts over 5 years. Whether that difference is clinically significant for Mars mission crew members is a research question that has not been definitively answered. Then there is the cardiovascular dimension, separate from the cancer risk. Research on astronauts who flew Apollo deep space missions in the 1960s and 1970s, missions that took them outside Earth's magnetic field for several days each, showed significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease in the decades following their missions compared to astronauts who flew only low Earth orbit missions of similar duration. The deep space exposure was measured in days. Mars mission exposure is measured in months. The proposed mechanism is radiation damage to the endothelial cells lining blood vessels, which accelerates the development of atherosclerosis. If the Apollo-era cardiovascular signal is real, and multiple studies have found it, then the cardiovascular disease risk among Mars mission veterans may be elevated above and beyond the cancer risk that receives more attention. The founding colonists will live and age on Mars, in a medical environment that cannot provide the cardiac imaging, surgical intervention, and pharmaceutical management that cardiovascular disease requires. Not one catastrophe, 1,000 slow degradations. The mission does not fail because an iron nucleus kills a cell. It fails because 1,000 iron nuclei per day, sustained for 253 days, degrade the biological substrate on which every aspect of the mission depends. There is one more dimension of the radiation problem that connects directly to the fourth wall, the self-sufficiency problem, in a way that is rarely discussed. The seeds and plant stock the colony depends on for food are also being irradiated. Cosmic rays penetrate the habitat walls and reach the agricultural growing areas. While the dose rate inside a shielded habitat is lower than on the open Martian surface, it is still substantially higher than what plants experience on Earth. High-energy particles cause mutations in plant DNA. Most of those mutations are neutral or harmful to the plant. Some will affect crops in ways that change yield, nutritional content, or disease resistance over successive generations. A colony growing crops for years inside a mildly irradiated greenhouse is running an uncontrolled crop genetics experiment simultaneously with its survival food production. The agricultural scientist managing this system must monitor plant health across generations for radiation-induced genetic drift, distinguishing radiation-driven change from normal natural variation in crops that have never before been grown in conditions remotely similar to a Martian greenhouse, with no commercial seed supplier to call, when a variety begins showing unexpected characteristics, and with the next seed delivery 780 days away if it was even ordered in the last window. This is not an insurmountable problem. Plant breeders have managed crop genetics under difficult conditions for centuries, but it is one more variable that the colony's food production system must track continuously and permanently, added to all the other variables that same system must manage simultaneously. The radiation problem is not a problem that ends at the human body. It extends through the entire biological fabric of the colony. From the people to the plants to the microorganisms the agricultural soil depends on, all of them accumulating mutations at rates higher than any of them would experience on Earth. All of those mutations potentially affecting colony survival in ways that are impossible to fully anticipate in advance. We have never put a human being in 0.38G for longer than a few hours, and we are planning to leave people there for years. Mars has gravity. This fact is consistently offered as a point in the planet's favour, as a reason to believe long-duration human habitation there is biologically plausible. The argument sounds reasonable. The International Space Station operates in microgravity, true zero-G, and the effects on crew members are serious and well documented. Bone density loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, fluid redistribution that causes vision changes in roughly 70% of long-duration astronauts. These effects require countermeasures, rehabilitation, and ongoing monitoring. But Mars has 38% of Earth's gravitational acceleration. Surely that substantial fraction prevents the worst of the zero-G effects. Surely 38% is biologically meaningful. This reasoning sounds solid. It fails at one specific point. Every piece of data about long-duration human physiology in low gravity comes from the ISS. The ISS is a microgravity environment. It tells us what happens to the human body at zero gravity over months and years. It says nothing reliable about what happens at exactly 0.38G for the durations a crewed Mars mission requires. The gap between those two data points is not a small extrapolation. It is a biological unknown of substantial size. No mammal has spent extended months in a controlled 0.38G environment with physiological monitoring sufficient to characterize the health trajectory. The Apollo lunar missions provided 12 human beings with brief exposure to 1/6 lunar gravity for a combined total of roughly 300 hours across all missions. The human body does not reveal its long-duration response to a gravitational environment in 300 hours. Let's be specific about what the ISS data shows, because it is the best information available, even though it is not the information we need. Bone density in weight-bearing skeletal regions, the hip, the lumbar spine, the femur, decreases at approximately 1 to 2% per month in microgravity. On Earth, bones continuously remodel themselves in response to mechanical loading. Standing against gravity signals bone-building cells to maintain mass. Remove that signal. Bone-resorbing cells continue their work. Bone-building cells slow. The balance tips. After 6 months on the ISS, astronauts typically return with bone density losses equivalent to several decades of age-related decline, compressed into half a year. Aggressive countermeasures, 2 to 3 hours of daily high-load resistance exercise combined with dietary supplementation, reduce the loss rate substantially, but do not eliminate it. Cardiovascular fitness follows a parallel trajectory. The heart adapts to the absence of gravitational loading by becoming smaller and less efficient at the pumping tasks it performs on Earth. The adaptation is measurable within weeks of arrival in microgravity. After months, the cardiovascular deconditioning requires sustained rehabilitation to reverse. Fluid that normally pools in the lower body under Earth's gravity redistributes upward in 0G, increasing intracranial pressure and distorting the optic nerve. The vision changes in 70% of long-duration ISS crew members are a direct consequence of this fluid shift. Now the actual unknown. Does 0.38 G prevent these effects? The honest answer is that the scientific community does not know. Not uncertain. Not debated among researchers. The data simply does not exist. The experiment has never been run. And the only way to answer the question with certainty is to send people to Mars and observe what happens to them over 2 years. The bone density question has a specific implication beyond the general health trajectory. Bone loss does not produce uniform structural weakness. It preferentially attacks trabecular bone, the internal lattice structure that provides compressive strength before cortical bone, the dense outer shell. Trabecular bone loss increases fracture risk most severely at the vertebral bodies of the spine, the femoral neck at the hip, and the wrist. A colonist with progressive bone loss from years at 0.38 G is moving toward an elevated fracture risk profile in an environment where a hip fracture requiring surgical repair and extended rehabilitation is not a manageable medical setback. It is a potential survival threat. The countermeasure protocol used on the ISS requires 2 to 3 hours of daily high-load resistance exercise. A colony where every member must spend that time on maintenance exercises is a colony where those hours are not available for the work of building and maintaining the colony itself. The countermeasure load is a real operational cost that does not decrease as the colony grows. It scales with population. Every additional colonist is another daily commitment of exercise hours. You do not need to absorb all of this simultaneously. Now for the dimension of the gravity problem that almost never enters public discussions about Mars: reproduction. A self-sustaining colony must eventually produce children. This is not a preference. It is a logical necessity. A population that cannot reproduce is a population with an expiration date determined by the ages of its founding members. For Mars to become a second home for the human species rather than a terminal outpost, people must be born there, develop there, and grow into adults capable of maintaining what was built. Whether that is biologically possible in 0.38 G is not known. No mammal has ever been conceived, gestated, or born in partial gravity under any controlled research conditions. The studies that exist on reproduction in reduced gravity are limited, short in duration, and conducted in 0G rather than partial gravity. Sea urchins fertilized in microgravity show irregular patterns in early cell division. Fish embryos raised in 0G develop structural abnormalities in vestibular organs. Rodent fetuses in microgravity show disruptions in developmental timing across multiple organ systems. These findings suggest that gravity provides a directional signal that embryonic tissue uses during development, not merely a mechanical force that bodies respond to after they're formed. Gravity informs the establishment of body axis orientation. It influences the folding and migration of early cell layers that form the body plan during the most critical periods of embryonic development. What human embryonic and fetal development looks like in a gravitational field 1/3 the strength of the field in which the human developmental program evolved is a question with no empirical answer. The first pregnancies on Mars will provide that answer, by living it. Here is where the third wall compounds the second. A body already carrying approximately 300 millisieverts of transit radiation with accumulated damage to bone marrow stem cells and neurons, is also the body that must now maintain itself in a gravitational field that may be insufficient to prevent progressive bone loss and cardiovascular deconditioning. These are not independent insults operating in isolated systems. Radiation damage suppresses the immune function that supports tissue repair. It disrupts the stem cell populations in bone marrow that maintain the constant renewal of blood cells and contribute to skeletal and connective tissue maintenance. Low gravity removes the mechanical loading signal that drives bone remodeling. Both processes are attacking the same biological maintenance system simultaneously. A body already compromised by one category of insult is less capable of defending against the second. The immune system changes in low gravity add another layer that connects directly to the radiation problem. Research on ISS crew members consistently documents immune dysregulation during long-duration spaceflight. Certain immune cells become less active. Latent herpes viruses, which most adults carry without symptoms, begin shedding at higher rates during spaceflight, suggesting the immune surveillance that normally keeps them suppressed is impaired. Wound healing is affected. The colony member who sustains a laceration during habitat maintenance is healing that wound with an immune system whose function may be impaired by both gravity and radiation effects simultaneously. Two systems that normally compensate for each other's failures are both degraded at the same time. Each wall raises the next one. Orbital geometry sets the transit duration. Transit duration sets the radiation dose. Radiation dose arrives in bodies that must now function under gravity we have never tested at the required durations. The gravity we have never tested operates on bodies carrying damage that cannot be undone. And those bodies still have to eat, still have to breathe, still have to build the civilization they came to establish. The muscle atrophy question in partial gravity is worth examining specifically in the context of what the colony actually needs its members to do. A Mars colony is not a place where light desk work is the primary demand on its population. It is a place where physical labour is fundamental and continuous. Constructing and maintaining pressurized habitats, installing and repairing life support infrastructure in spacesuits, operating and maintaining agricultural systems that require physical manipulation of soil, plants and equipment across long work shifts, managing water extraction from subsurface ice deposits. All of these activities require muscle groups that, in partial gravity, may be progressively less capable of performing them. The ISS countermeasure exercise program works because the station is a research facility with 6 crew members whose primary job is science, and whose secondary obligation is maintaining their own health as a research requirement. The ISS schedule is built around making time for exercise, because the exercise is part of the research protocol. A Mars colony is a production facility, a survival enterprise, a civilization-building project. The margin for daily countermeasure exercise in a colony where every person's labour is essential to collective survival is much smaller than what ISS crew members have available. If the countermeasure exercise is reduced because there is too much essential work to do, the physiological trajectory of the colony's population moves in a direction that may impair the physical work the colony needs from them. It is a feedback loop with no clean resolution. The harder you work, the less time you have for the exercise that keeps you capable of hard work. The vision changes documented in 70% of long-duration ISS crew members deserve specific attention in the Mars context, because vision is not a minor quality of life concern for people operating in spacesuits, repairing life support equipment, and managing agricultural systems that require precise observation. The mechanism driving the vision changes is increased intracranial pressure caused by fluid redistribution in microgravity. Whether 0.38 G produces the same effect, a reduced effect, or a different effect entirely is unknown. But if vision degradation occurs in a significant fraction of Mars colonists over years of surface residence, it is occurring in people who need their vision for every critical task the colony depends on them to perform. It is occurring in an environment where ophthalmological specialists and the equipment required to diagnose and treat the underlying condition are not available through the next supply window. The connection between partial gravity and the colony's reproductive future has a dimension that goes beyond the immediate biological question of whether conception and development can proceed normally at 0.38 g. It connects to the legal, ethical, and social frameworks the colony will need to function as a community across generations. Who has the authority to regulate reproduction in a closed, resource-constrained colony? What happens when a pregnancy proceeds in an environment where no one knows whether the fetal development will be normal? What are the colony's obligations to a child born into physiological conditions that were not chosen by that child? These are not engineering questions. They are governance questions. They are social questions. They are the kinds of questions that require institutions, norms, and frameworks developed over time by the people who live them. And none of those institutions and norms exist yet because no one has ever lived this situation before. Here is how all three of the first walls connect in a way that makes the fourth wall inevitable. The orbital window forces a transit of 7 to 9 months. The transit delivers a radiation dose that exceeds career limits and damages bone marrow stem cells and neurons. The body carrying that damage must now maintain itself in a gravitational field that may be insufficient to drive normal bone remodeling and cardiovascular maintenance. The systems most needed to repair radiation damage, the immune system, and the stem cell populations in bone marrow, are being simultaneously stressed by the partial gravity environment. The crew that arrives at Mars is not the crew that left Earth in terms of biological integrity. They arrive already carrying costs, and the colony they are about to build, the colony that must become self-sufficient or fail, depends on them functioning at a level that the environment has been systematically degrading since the engines cut out 9 months ago. Not one catastrophe. 1,000 slow degradations. The question of what happens to the colony's population over multiple generations at 0.38 g, if it turns out that 0.38 g is insufficient to maintain normal bone and cardiovascular health, is not just a medical question. It is a question about the long-term viability of the colony as a self-sustaining civilization. Consider the trajectory. The founding generation arrives already carrying radiation damage from the transit. They establish the colony's basic infrastructure. They begin the agricultural systems. They maintain the life support hardware. They age in an environment we have never tested for long-term human habitation. Their children, if the reproductive biology works at 0.38 g, are born into this environment and grow up in it. Those children's bodies develop under 0.38 g from birth, from before birth, from embryonic development. They may adapt to it in ways the founding generation, whose bodies were formed at 1 g, cannot. They may develop physiologies that function optimally at 0.38 g, but that would struggle if they ever tried to stand up under Earth's gravity. By the second generation, the colony may contain people who are physiologically Martian in a meaningful sense, not alien, not unrecognizable, but different from Earth humans in ways that are grounded in the physics of where they grew up. Their bones may be adapted to 0.3 g loading. Their cardiovascular systems may have calibrated to the reduced gravitational demands of their home planet. Their immune systems have encountered only the pathogens of a sealed colony, not the full ecosystem of Earth's biosphere. If they were taken to Earth, they might struggle in ways that their parents who grew up on Earth did not. Return for the second generation might not be an option even in principle. This is not a tragedy. It is a description of what a genuinely successful Mars colony would eventually look like, but it changes the nature of the project from space travel in the conventional sense to something that has no precise historical parallel. It is not colonization in the historical sense, because there is no indigenous population and no territory being claimed. It is not a military outpost because it has no military adversary and no force projection role. It is closest to the founding of a new civilization, with all the uncertainty and permanence that the phrase implies. The people who go to Mars early are not just visiting a difficult place. They are planting a flag for a new branch of the human family tree. Whether that branch flourishes or withers depends on 4 things, and we have known what those 4 things are since the beginning of this script. The psychological dimension of not knowing deserves its own examination, because it operates on the founding colonists before any of the physiological consequences have become clear. A Mars colonist living on the surface knows that the gravity they experience every day may or may not be sufficient to maintain their skeletal health. They cannot know. No one can know yet. They will have bone density scans at whatever intervals the colony's medical equipment permits, and those scans will show them numbers, and those numbers may be declining. But whether that decline is within the range of what 0.38 G is expected to produce, or whether it represents a concerning deviation from expected trajectory, is a question that cannot be answered without the baseline data of what 0.38 G is expected to produce, and that baseline data does not exist. Living with that uncertainty continuously, month after month, year after year, is a form of psychological stress that has no direct analogue in other human experiences. You are in an experiment. You are one of its subjects. The experiment has no control group. Its results will not be known for decades. And if the results turn out to be bad, the time to have acted on that information, to have modified the countermeasure protocol, or altered the habitat design or made different choices about mission duration, may have already passed. The founding colonists will be managing this uncertainty, while simultaneously performing the physical and intellectual labour required to build a civilization from scratch. They will be doing it under radiation exposure that impairs the cognitive function they need for that work. They will be doing it in partial gravity that may be progressively reducing the physical capacity they need for that labour. They will be doing it in communication isolation from everyone they have ever known who is not currently in the habitat with them, and they will be doing it with no exit. That is not an argument against going. It is a description of what going requires of the people who go. It requires something that has no name in the existing vocabulary of human courage or endurance, because the combination of conditions it describes has never been required of any human being before. A Mars colony cannot be resupplied. It can only be abandoned or sustained by things it grows itself. Picture a specific morning on Mars. A colonist wakes up with pain in the lower right quadrant of her abdomen, sharp, localized, worsening across 2 hours. The colony physician examines her, elevated white blood cell count, guarding and rebound tenderness, classic presentation of acute appendicitis. On Earth, this is a routine surgical emergency. An ambulance arrives, a surgeon operates within hours, recovery takes 2 weeks, the patient goes home. On Mars, the next supply window is 26 months away. The orbital geometry will not allow a return launch for approximately 500 days. The colony physician performs the appendectomy in a pressurized habitat module with limited sterile volume, with the surgical instruments and anesthetic agents the colony brought from Earth, with no backup surgeon. This is not a failure of planning or of courage. It is a description of the minimum competence the environment imposes on anyone who lives there. Let that settle before we go further. The appendicitis scenario is not chosen because it is dramatic. It is chosen because it is ordinary. Place 100 people on Mars for 2 years. Medical probability guarantees someone among them will experience acute appendicitis, or a myocardial infarction, or a kidney stone requiring procedural intervention, or a compound fracture from a habitat maintenance accident, or a severe psychiatric episode requiring pharmacological management and sustained supervision. These are not catastrophic rare events. They are baseline medical expectations for any normal human population living anywhere for any significant period of time. Every single one of them on Mars must be handled with the resources the colony brought or can produce locally. There is no evacuation pathway. There is no specialist consultation in real time. The communication delay between Earth and Mars runs between 3 and 22 minutes one way, depending on orbital geometry at the time. A question sent from the colony to Earth and answered immediately takes between 6 and 44 minutes round trip. You cannot guide emergency surgery through a 44-minute communication cycle. A system 99% reliable over 1 year is 90% reliable over 10 years. Over 100 years, failure becomes virtual certainty. Now scale that to the entire life support infrastructure of a colony. Every pump, every seal, every filter, every circuit board in every piece of critical equipment, each has a mean time between failures. On Earth, the response to a component failing is a replacement from a supply chain that delivers in days or weeks. On Mars, the supply chain delivers what was ordered 26 months ago. If the right part was not anticipated and ordered in advance, it is not available for 780 days minimum. The maintenance engineering of a Mars colony therefore requires anticipating years in advance every component that might fail during the current supply cycle, every pump bearing, every electrical relay, every seal in the water recycling system, every heating element in the greenhouse lighting array. Every one of these must be identified, ordered, manufactured on Earth, launched in a cargo window, decelerated into Mars orbit, and landed before it is needed. Miss 1. The colony either improvises, fabricates from local resources, or waits for the next window. Manufacturing capability on Mars is therefore not optional equipment for a serious long-term colony. It is as fundamental as food production. Begin with food. The Martian surface material, the regolith that covers the planet in layers tens of meters deep, does not support agricultural production in its natural state. It contains perchlorates, chlorine-based compounds toxic to most terrestrial plants at Martian concentrations and toxic to humans in quantity. It lacks the organic matter, the nitrogen compounds, and the microbial communities that make Earth soil fertile. Growing food in processed Martian regolith requires first removing perchlorates through bioremediation or chemical washing, then amending the washed material with organic matter and nutrients, then inoculating it with appropriate microbial populations, then enclosing everything inside pressurized greenhouse structures, because the ambient Martian atmosphere outside is 95% carbon dioxide at less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure. Those greenhouses require continuous power for artificial lighting. Mars receives roughly 43% of the solar irradiance that reaches Earth's surface. Dust storms periodically reduce that fraction to near zero for weeks or months at a time. The global dust storm of 2018 persisted for more than 3 months, covering the entire planet. Solar irradiance during that storm dropped to levels that would have made photosynthesis-based food production functionally impossible throughout. A colony relying primarily on solar power for its food production faces the scenario where the primary energy input for food growth is interrupted for extended periods with limited warning. The colony's food storage must be large enough to sustain the entire population through the worst historical dust storm on record, plus a margin for uncertainty, which means food production under normal conditions must exceed current consumption by that reserve amount, which requires more greenhouse area, more power, more labour, more equipment. Nuclear fission provides the most reliable alternative power source. Small modular reactors can operate independently of sunlight and dust. But delivering a functioning reactor to Mars, commissioning it safely with a small crew using available tools, and maintaining it over decades without industrial supply chains is itself a set of engineering problems not yet solved. The MOXIE experiment on Perseverance demonstrated that oxygen can be produced from Martian carbon dioxide by electrolysis. That proof of concept is genuinely encouraging. Scaling it from the small experimental unit on Perseverance to a system capable of providing oxygen for a colony of hundreds requires power output many orders of magnitude higher than MOXIE demonstrated. That power must be available continuously without interruption. Water exists on Mars in the form of subsurface ice deposits, that orbital radar instruments have mapped extensively. Extraction requires drilling hardware capable of reaching ice at depth, heating systems to melt it, collection and transport infrastructure, and purification systems to remove perchlorates and other contaminants to potable standards. All of this hardware must operate in Martian temperatures that drop well below -100 degrees Celsius at night, in the presence of fine perchlorate-bearing dust that damages mechanical equipment, maintained by a crew simultaneously performing every other task required to keep the habitat pressurized and the food growing. The water recycling challenge compounds this. A closed habitat loses water through every biological process its inhabitants engage in. Respiration, perspiration, urine, all of it must be captured and returned to the usable inventory at near-perfect efficiency. The ISS achieves approximately 90% water recovery under operational conditions. The remaining 10% is compensated by regular resupply from Earth. A Mars colony cannot be resupplied on the ISS's schedule. Its water recovery must approach 100% or the inventory depletes. 100% recovery is an asymptote. Every imperfect seal, every saturated filter, every biological or chemical process that converts water to a form the recycling system cannot recover represents a permanent reduction in the colony's water capital. Now, the cascading failure structure that makes all of these individual problems worse than their individual descriptions suggest. A colony on Mars is a network. Every element depends on every other element. Agricultural production requires water from the recycling system, nutrients from the waste processing system, carbon dioxide from crew respiration, and light from the power system. The crew requires oxygen from plant photosynthesis, food from agricultural harvest, and clean water from recycling. The waste processing system requires biological inputs from both crew and crops to maintain the microbial communities that decompose organic material back into forms the agricultural and recycling systems can use. Power must flow continuously to all systems without interruption. If any node in this network degrades significantly, the effects propagate. A contamination event enters the water recycling system. Crew members fall ill. Ill crew members cannot maintain the agricultural systems on schedule. Crops go untended. Yields drop below the colony's caloric requirement. Reduced photosynthetic activity produces less oxygen. Carbon dioxide levels rise. The atmospheric management system is already handling increased metabolic output from febrile crew members. Power is diverted to additional water purification cycles, which reduces power available for crop lighting, which reduces photosynthetic yield further. Malnourished crew members are less capable of performing the maintenance tasks required to repair the contaminated water processing equipment. The spiral continues in each direction simultaneously. This pattern is not a constructed worst case. Biosphere 2, the most ambitious sealed habitat experiment ever conducted on Earth, saw oxygen levels fall so far within 2 years of its initial closure that the crew experienced measurable cognitive impairment, and the project administrators pumped oxygen from outside the sealed structure to prevent further decline. Biosphere 2 was constructed in the Arizona desert, with full external support a short drive away. On Mars, there is no outside to draw from. There is only the colony, its resources, and the 780-day gap before the next supply window. The ship may fly. The engines may burn. The hull may hold. But inside that hull, something else is happening. If what you've heard tonight has changed how you think about this, a subscribe helps this channel keep making exactly this kind of work. It matters more than it might seem. There is a specific biological interaction between the radiation environment and the food supply chain that connects 2 of the 4 walls in a way that is not immediately obvious. The seeds and plant stock the colony depends on for food are also being irradiated. Cosmic rays penetrate the habitat walls and reach the agricultural growing areas. While the dose rate inside a shielded habitat is lower than on the open Martian surface, it is still substantially higher than what plants experience on Earth. High-energy particles can cause mutations in plant DNA. Most mutations are neutral or harmful to the plant. Some will affect crops in ways that change yield, nutritional content, or disease resistance over successive generations. A colony growing crops for years inside a mildly irradiated greenhouse is running an uncontrolled crop genetics experiment simultaneously with its survival food production. The agricultural scientists managing this system must monitor plant health across generations for radiation-induced genetic drift in crops that have never before been grown in conditions remotely similar to a Martian greenhouse, with no external expertise available in real time. The social and governance dimension of a Mars colony is the one that receives the least technical analysis and may be among the most practically important. A colony of any significant size is a community. Communities require governance. They require mechanisms for resolving disputes before those disputes become colony-threatening conflicts. They require norms of behaviour that most members accept. They require systems for distributing resources, including scarce resources during a supply crisis, in ways that most members experience as at least minimally fair. Research on isolated communities in analogue environments, Antarctic winter overstations, submarine crews, long-duration ISS missions consistently finds that the most challenging interpersonal dynamics emerge not during acute crises, but during the extended periods of routine stress and monotony between crises. A Mars colony is not a 6-month ISS mission. It is a multi-year or permanent commitment with no rotation option for most of its members. The communication delay adds a category of isolation that deserves its own examination. The delay between Earth and Mars runs between 3 and 22 minutes one way. The emotional and social support relationships that Earth-resident humans maintain with family, friends, and mental health professionals are replaced, for Mars colonists, with asynchronous exchanges that feel more like correspondence than conversation. You send a message describing how you feel. 11 minutes later, the message arrives. Sometime later, a response is composed. 11 minutes after that, the response arrives back. What took 5 seconds in an Earth phone call has taken half an hour or more, and has lost most of its emotional immediacy in the delay. Furthermore, roughly every 26 months, Earth and Mars enter solar conjunction, when the Sun sits between the two planets from Earth's perspective. Radio signals passing between them must travel through or near the solar corona, the superheated plasma of the Sun's outer atmosphere. The interference is severe enough that reliable communication becomes impossible. NASA suspends communication with Mars orbiters and rovers during conjunction periods for several weeks. A Mars colony experiences that suspension too. For several weeks every 26 months, reliable communication with Earth is severed entirely. The colonists who experience conjunction for the first time, cut off from every person they know on their birth planet, are experiencing a form of isolation that has no real terrestrial parallel. The history of Mars mission planning reflects a pattern called optimism bias, the tendency to systematically underestimate the number and severity of obstacles not yet encountered. Every plan published with a confident timeline has slipped. Every cost estimate released has grown upon closer examination. This is not evidence that the planners were incompetent or dishonest. It is evidence that the challenges are genuinely novel, and genuine novelty is resistant to accurate advance estimation. Every Mars estimate in the past 70 years has proven optimistic. That pattern is not noise. That pattern is information. What makes this a civilization problem rather than a logistics problem is the following. Building a self-sufficient Mars colony requires constructing, from materials shipped across hundreds of millions of kilometers in 26-month intervals, a closed system capable of indefinitely sustaining human life in all its biological and social complexity. Food production, water recovery, atmospheric management, power generation, manufacturing, medical care, education, governance, psychological support, biological reproduction across generations. Without depending on external input for any of these functions, the gap between where that capability is today and where it needs to be for genuine self-sufficiency is not a gap measured in years, it is a gap measured in generations. The first crew to land on Mars will not close it. They will initiate the process. The colony will become more capable with each decade of accumulated investment and learning. Self-sufficiency, if it arrives slowly and at the cost of continuous Earth support during the most vulnerable phase of the colony's existence. If that support is interrupted before self-sufficiency is achieved, the colony does not survive the interruption. The spare parts problem has a depth that goes beyond simple inventory management. Every component in a Mars colony's life support infrastructure has a failure rate. In a terrestrial setting, when a component fails, the supply chain delivers a replacement in days or weeks. On Mars, the supply chain delivers what was ordered 26 months ago and what was anticipated as necessary at that time. The supply window does not permit rapid response to unexpected failures. It permits ordered preparation for anticipated ones. This means the colony must maintain an inventory large enough to cover all plausible failures across the full 26-month supply cycle, plus a margin for failures that were not anticipated. The mass of that inventory is not small. Every spare seal for every pipe in the water recycling system, every replacement heating element for the greenhouse lighting arrays, every circuit board in every piece of life support equipment that lacks a backup, every surgical instrument that might break or be contaminated during an emergency procedure, every pharmacological agent that might be needed for conditions the colony physician might encounter in a population of the relevant size over a 2-year period. Each of these has a weight. All of those weights together constitute a significant fraction of the colony's total launched mass. And mass is the one thing that the window constrains most severely. Every kilogram launched toward Mars costs propellant to accelerate. Every kilogram of propellant costs additional kilogram of propellant to accelerate the propellant itself. The rocket equation is not linear, it is exponential. A colony that needs to carry a comprehensive spare parts inventory must therefore launch significantly more than a colony that does not, which requires more propellant, which requires more launches, which requires more windows, which requires years of additional prepositioning activity before the crewed mission can even depart. The duration inversion of this is worth stating explicitly. A water recycling component that is 99% reliable over 1 year is 90% reliable over 10 years. Over 20 years, the probability of at least one failure reaches 87%. The colony is not designed for a 10-year mission. It is designed for permanence. Every system in it will eventually fail and require replacement. Not might fail, will fail. The spare parts inventory is not optional equipment. It is the buffer between the colony functioning and the colony cascading toward failure. And the size of that buffer is constrained by the mass budget, which is constrained by the window. There is also the history of predictions about Mars that deserves explicit mention. In almost every case, initial estimates of cost, development time, and technical difficulty have proven to be underestimates. Every plan published with a confident timeline has slipped. Every cost estimate released has grown upon closer examination. The 90-day study in 1989 estimated mission costs that were considered so high they ended the political discussion for a decade. Later analyses suggested the estimates were themselves optimistic. The pattern has repeated across every generation of Mars planning. This is not evidence that the planners were incompetent or dishonest. It is evidence of optimism bias, the tendency to systematically underestimate the number and severity of obstacles not yet encountered. Genuine novelty is resistant to accurate advance estimation. You cannot fully anticipate the difficulty of solving a problem you have never solved. The corrective is not pessimism, it is precision. Precision about what is known and what is not known. Precision about which challenges are solved in principle and which are solved in practice. The Moxie experiment on Perseverance producing oxygen from Martian carbon dioxide is a genuine achievement and a genuine proof of concept. It is not an operational oxygen production system for a Mars colony. That distinction matters enormously for planning, because it defines the gap between where the technology is today and where it needs to be for a colony to depend on it. That gap is real and measurable. Acknowledging it accurately is the only basis on which realistic plans to close it can be made. The void does not care about our ambitions. The colony does not fail because something dramatic happens. It fails because nothing dramatic happens for so long that the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small degradations exceeds the colony's capacity to cope. The psychological dimension of a permanent Mars colony has a depth that short-duration missions do not expose. On the ISS, the psychological challenges are real but bounded. The crew knows the mission has an end date. They know they will return home. They know Earth is 250 miles below them, visible through the window, its weather systems and coastlines recognizable. The confinement is temporary. The isolation is partial. Communication with family and friends is possible without meaningful delay. The psychological literature on ISS crew members shows that even with all of these mitigating factors, long-duration missions produce measurable effects on mood, motivation, interpersonal dynamics, and cognitive performance, particularly in the mid-mission period when the novelty of the experience has worn off and the end is still far away. A permanent Mars colony removes every one of those mitigating factors. The mission does not have an end date. There is no return home for most colonists. Earth is not visible through the window as a familiar blue sphere. It is a bright dot in the Martian sky, indistinguishable from a star to the naked eye, carrying in its tiny light every person the colonist has ever known who is not currently standing beside them. Communication delay makes real-time emotional support from family and friends impossible. The mid-mission psychological dip that ISS crews experience and recover from is not a temporary valley in a trajectory that leads upward. For a permanent colonist, it is the permanent condition. Research on isolated communities has not been able to fully characterize what this does to human beings over periods of years, because no isolated community in the history of analog research has faced the combination of permanence, total communication delay, and physiological uncertainty that Mars colonists will face. Antarctic winter rover stations come closest, but Antarctic personnel know they will leave after a year. They can communicate with the outside world at any time. They are not carrying above career limit radiation dose. They are not wondering whether the gravity they live in is slowly degrading their bones in ways that may not be reversible. The governance and social structure of a Mars colony is therefore not a secondary concern to be designed after the engineering is complete. It is an engineering problem in its own right. The social systems of the colony, the decision-making frameworks, the conflict resolution mechanisms, the resource allocation protocols, the norms around reproduction and privacy and property, must be designed with the same rigor and the same anticipation of failure modes as the water recycling system and the atmospheric management infrastructure. A colony whose social systems fail will not survive, regardless of the state of its engineering systems. A colony whose members cannot cooperate, cannot resolve disputes, cannot maintain collective purpose across years of difficulty and deprivation, will not maintain the engineering systems that keep it alive. The two categories of challenge are not separable. The history of Mars planning suggests that the social and governance dimension is the most consistently underweighted part of the challenge. Mission architecture documents detail the mass budget to the kilogram and the radiation shielding to the centimetre. They rarely specify how a colony of 200 people will decide what to eat, who does which work, how disputes about resource allocation will be resolved, what happens when two colonists have a child that neither wanted, who has the authority to override the colony physician's judgment in a medical emergency, and what recourse a colonist has if they believe the colony leadership has made a decision that puts their life at risk. These are not hypothetical edge cases. They are the governance challenges that every human community larger than a family encounters. They have no single correct answer. They require institutions, norms, precedents, and collective investment in their own maintenance. Building those institutions from scratch in a closed environment under sustained stress without the benefit of the accumulated social technology that Earth civilizations have developed over millennia of trial and error is one of the hardest parts of what a Mars colony must do. The medical infrastructure question has a specific dimension that goes beyond the appendicitis scenario. A Mars colony must have the capability to perform surgery, manage chronic disease, provide psychiatric care, handle obstetric emergencies if the colony reproduces, and address the long-term health consequences of radiation exposure that will manifest in its founding population as they age. This is not a list of nice-to-have capabilities. Each of these represents a category of medical need that will occur in any population living for years. The question is not whether these needs will arise. The question is what the colony does when they arise. The medical personnel available to the colony are those who were selected and trained before departure. On a mission of 6 crew members, perhaps 1 or 2 have significant medical training. The complement cannot include a fully trained surgeon, an anesthesiologist, a psychiatrist, an oncologist, a cardiologist, an obstetrician, an ophthalmologist, and a specialist in radiation medicine. The human body is too complex and too fragile for any small team to cover every possible failure mode. For every medical scenario that falls outside the training and equipment available on site, the colony must improvise, or the patient must accept the consequences of not receiving indicated care. This is not a solvable problem through better crew selection or better pre-mission training. No amount of training can make a generalist into a specialist for every possible specialty required. No amount of preparation can anticipate every medical scenario that will arise over years in a novel physiological environment. The colony will face medical situations for which it is not fully prepared. How it handles those situations will depend on the quality of its medical personnel, the comprehensiveness of its equipment inventory, the resourcefulness of its improvisation, and, in some cases, the willingness of patients to accept outcomes that Earth medicine would not have to accept. That is the medical reality of Mars, not a failure of planning, the irreducible consequence of being 400 million kilometers from the nearest hospital. The 4 walls are not 4 separate problems, they are 4 perspectives on the same problem. The problem is that Mars is not configured for human beings, not in the chemistry of its surface material, not in the strength of its gravity, not in the absence of its magnetic field, not in the distance its orbital position places between the colony and the civilization that supports it. The planet did not evolve to accommodate human biology. The biology did not evolve to accommodate Mars. Everything required to sustain human life on Mars must be either brought from Earth or manufactured from Martian resources using technology that does not yet exist at the required scale. Every day of survival on Mars is a vote against entropy, a vote that must be cast with sufficient resources, sufficient knowledge, sufficient human capacity, and sufficient luck every single day, indefinitely. That is not an impossible standard, but it is a high one, and it is higher than any human enterprise has previously had to meet. The self-sufficiency threshold the colony must reach is not just about producing enough food and oxygen and clean water to survive. It is about producing them at a rate that allows the colony to grow. A colony that produces exactly enough to sustain its current population cannot grow. If it cannot grow, it cannot become more capable. If it cannot become more capable, it remains permanently dependent on Earth support for the capabilities it lacks. The self-sufficiency threshold is therefore not survival, it is surplus. The colony must produce more than it consumes, so that the excess can be invested in expanding its capabilities, in training more specialists, in building more redundant infrastructure, in conducting the research required to answer the questions that Earth-based analysis cannot answer from a distance. That surplus requires labour, and labour requires people, and people require food and water and oxygen and medical care and housing and governance and psychological support. The colony's path to self-sufficiency runs through a phase of intense investment, of building the capacity that will eventually produce the surplus, during which it is most dependent on Earth support and most vulnerable to disruption. Getting through that phase, maintaining the colony during its most vulnerable period, is the hardest part of the whole project. Not the launch, not the transit, not the landing. The years of building before the colony can sustain itself, and all of that building happens 26 months between supply windows. 7 to 9 months in interplanetary space. That is where this began. The Curiosity rover's instruments, a measurement from a transit that has already happened. That number does not change regardless of who builds the next rocket or how strongly anyone wants to be on Mars. The physics recorded in that instrument in 2012 will be the physics that every future crew experiences on the same arc. The dose does not negotiate. The crossing does not shorten without propulsion technology that does not yet fly on crewed missions. The career limit has already been passed in the transit alone. The 4 barriers described tonight share a route that is not budgetary and not political. Mars is hostile in every direction simultaneously. To the transit that delivers people to its surface, to the biology of the bodies making that transit, to those same bodies after they have landed, in a gravity that may or may not sustain them over years, to the supply chains required to keep them alive and functional across the decades that self-sufficiency demands. Human spaceflight has a history of solving problems that once appeared to be permanent walls. The radiation problem may have an answer in shielding configurations not yet validated. The gravity question may have a survivable answer that the first crewed mission reveals. Self-sufficiency timelines may compress as technologies mature in ways current analysis does not anticipate. But the 26-month window does not yield. It is orbital geometry. The arrangement of 2 planets around a star on a schedule set 4.5 billion years ago. No rocket changes it. No amount of urgency accelerates the calendar. There is a category of challenge specific to permanent Mars colonists that has no real parallel in the history of human migration. Every human migration in history, including migrations across oceans and through hostile territory, has involved people moving to a place from which they could theoretically return. Mars removes this possibility for most permanent settlers, not because return is physically impossible, but because the biological changes accumulated over years at 0.38 G and in elevated radiation may make the colonist progressively less capable of tolerating Earth's full gravity. A person who has lived on Mars for 10 years may have a physiological profile that makes return medically inadvisable. The colonists who commit to Mars accept whatever physiological baseline 0.38 G produces as their permanent operational state. In time, the colony will become its own cultural entity with its own norms, its own relationship to Mars as home and Earth as a place of origin that most members will never see. They will be the founders of a genuinely new human community whose relationship to humanity's home planet will evolve in ways that cannot be fully predicted from here. The window opens again, and again, and again, on its own schedule, with no knowledge of whether the biology questions have answers yet, or whether the water system held through the latest dust storm, or whether the children born there are developing as children are supposed to develop. It opens because the planets move. It closes because they keep moving. It does not wait for any of that. That is where the real answer lives. Not in the size of the rocket, not in the motivation of the crew, in a planet that simply continues its orbit. Thank you for staying all the way through tonight. If this gave you something worth keeping, a like or a subscribe helps more people find their way here. The window opens again in 26 months. The window opens again. That is the fact that ties all 4 walls together in a way that no amount of analysis fully dissolves. The 26-month window does not wait for the biology to be understood. It does not pause for the propulsion technology to mature. It does not pause for the governance frameworks to be designed. It does not pause for the spare parts inventory to be catalogued, for the doctors to be trained, for the food systems to be validated at scale. It opens on its orbital schedule, driven by the same gravitational mechanics that have governed the solar system since before Earth had oceans, and it closes again whether or not humans are ready to walk through it. There is something clarifying about this. The window is not a problem to be solved, it is the context inside which all other problems must be solved. It is the structure of the situation, and structures of situations do not respond to ambition or funding or urgency. They respond only to the work of actually solving the problems they contain. What that work looks like, done honestly, and at the required scale, is what the 4 walls of this script have described. Not 4 obstacles to be overcome one at a time in sequence. 4 coupled problems that share inputs and outputs, that each make the others harder, that must be addressed as a system rather than as a checklist. A civilization that wants to become a multi-planetary species is not a civilization that needs a better rocket. It is a civilization that needs a better understanding of what living in another gravity well does to human biology over generations. A radiation mitigation technology that actually works at the doses Mars requires. A self-sufficiency engineering framework that has been validated at colony scale rather than experiment scale, and social and governance institutions designed specifically for the conditions of a permanently isolated, resource-constrained, physiologically novel human community. That is not an impossible list. It is a long one. None of it is achieved by announcing a launch date. The window opens again in 26 months.